Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. In this episode, we're going to answer your listener questions for April of 2026. And we have some interesting questions that are a little bit different than normal, Justin, and actually cover some really good examples of things to watch out for, I will say, in the industry.
That's right, man. And some good questions are coming up on tax season too, which, happy tax season to everybody.
Yeah, don't remind me. I think tax day, by the time you're listening to this, will be just a week or two away. And as of this recording date, I haven't even started putting mine together. So I've got the clock is ticking, and I'm almost positive we're going to be filing an extension this year.
I'm right there with you, man. The accountants kind of see us coming, don't they, with the mineral rights?
Absolutely. Let's talk about this first question. You want to read what Scott has to say?
Yeah, so Scott says, when completing a mineral rights appraisal and the yield capitalization process, do you add the total cash flows plus a value of the property derived from another method or just the cash flows? And Matt, this comes back to having some evaluation for the property, which is always a tricky thing and can be nuanced in that you might need a different type of evaluation for different situation, tax versus sell or something else.
Yeah, it just depends on the level of detail, but the overall process is the same. And the methodology that's primarily used to appraise mineral rights is a discounted cash flow analysis. And so, Scott, to your question, it's very similar, and I'm not like a super expert on real estate, capitalization and yield calculations. I know enough to be dangerous, and so I'll answer from that perspective. So take this with a grain of salt. But from my understanding, that when you have the yield capitalization process for real estate investment property, it's very similar, and you have the discounted cash flow analysis from rent and subtracting out your expenses and all of that, and then you add that up, and then year zero you can calculate what the net present value is, and you determine what that property is worth to you. The difference is, from my understanding, in calculating that yield capitalization rate, is you also take into account the proceeds from the sale of the property at some point in the future. Well, with minerals, you could approach it that way, but that's not the way we do it. We look at it from the standpoint of holding on to the property for the life of the wells, because the primary use of that property is to produce oil and gas in terms of minerals and royalties. And so we look at it from those future royalty payments as this future stream of cash flow, discount that back to today based on certain specific discount rates. Whereas maybe in a real estate investment, you're picking the desired discount rate or desired rate of return. With minerals and royalties, you're sort of at the mercy of SEC guidelines in terms of what the operator can book, in terms of reserves. And you have to sort of take that into account, because that affects when maybe new wells are going to get drilled. And all of that goes into that whole discounted cash flow analysis. So when we value minerals, whether it's from a quick valuation without a formal appraisal report or going through the very formal and rigorous appraisal process, generally speaking, we use the discounted cash flow analysis. We supplement that with, if we have any market data to substantiate or to support the value that we come up with that discounted cash flow, we'll use that. But, it's supplemental to, so it's usually an either or, right? You're using, if you have recent comps that are like, hey, this same property, someone else's interest in the same property just sold and they sold it for X. Well, that's a direct comp that you could potentially use. Whereas most of the time you don't have access to any sort of sales data or very limited sales data. So you have to do a discounted cash flow analysis to determine the value of the mineral property. So hopefully that answers your question, Scott. And, great question. Thanks for writing in.
Our next one here is from Greg. Greg says, hi, love the show. I own mineral rights on the Texas side of the Haynesville, Nacogdoches County, and it was looking for some feedback on a lease. So he says, I have an offer to renew my lease. The offer is 14.3 net mineral acres across 7 tracts. And they're offering $300 a net mineral acre. When evaluating their offer, should I consider these factors when assessing their bonus? And he sent a news article to a Mitsubishi $8 billion interest in Haynesville Shell, and then goes on to ask some other questions. But Matt, let's start with that Mitsubishi mention. And can they influence the bonus was his question in that.
So I would say no. So that Mitsubishi acquiring Aethon Energy Haynesville Shale assets was really a purchase, right? So they're buying current production plus future reserves. And so it doesn't, other than it shows that there's continued interest in the Haynesville and there's competition there, but that acquisition itself, I don't think is going to have any sort of impact on lease bonus rates. In fact, it could be argued that they're not going to have as much money. And if you're in that former Aethon acreage, it depends on Mitsubishi's take on what their capital spending is going to be. And is it going to be a negative or a positive in terms of how much money they're going to spend in developing the additional acreage? And so that's the big question rather than the actual acquisition itself. So maybe if there's a difference there and it's a positive difference, it could help. But ultimately, what determines the bonus is the value of the minerals, right? The underlying oil and gas reserves and what that is worth, and then be a fraction of that for what they're willing to pay for the bonus amount. And typically what we do, we can actually guesstimate that, I would say, because there are a lot of market forces at play there, so that we can do it from a scientific engineering perspective and say the value of the oil and gas reserves associated with that mineral tract is X. And so the lease bonus ought to be divide by 2 or 3 to get the actual bonus amount. So a way to think about that is if the value of the minerals is $3,000 per net mineral acre, the lease bonus, the targeted or a reasonable or desired lease bonus might be $1,000 an acre. Now, of course, all of the things that go into that are, the biggest impact is the royalty rate. And so oftentimes people get hung up on trying to go for the largest lease bonus amount and giving up a good royalty rate in exchange for that. And I think that is short-sighted, and that's something you don't want to do. The way to think about it and trying to negotiate the strongest lease possible is, rather than trying to get the highest dollar per net mineral acre from a lease bonus perspective, but it would be to get better lease clauses, like you suggested. I think, and he writes this in his email, is that, what are the things that I should take into account in negotiating the lease? Is there, all the things like processing plants, pipelines, gathering expansions, all of those should be information to understand how quickly they might come and develop your minerals, which could influence the terms you're able to get. But I think, as you suggest here, and Greg writes and mentions a no deductions and, marketable product language. And I think that no post-production deduction language is the single biggest advantage if you can negotiate for that in your lease, because it minimizes the amount that they're going to whittle away at your royalty payment from subtracting for marketing or for compression or for processing that gas, and particularly in a gas play like in the Haynesville. So that is definitely important. And there's other things, you can negotiate for as well. But I'd say that is probably one of the biggest things, in conjunction with trying to get the highest royalty rate possible, because the value of your minerals is directly proportional to the royalty rate. And the reason for that is because that royalty rate will determine the amount of royalties you get paid in the future. And again, like we talked about with that first question, when we do evaluation or an appraisal, we look at the discounted cash flows. So that means, what are my royalty payments going to be in the future? You discount that back to today to get a lump sum or the net present value and what that property is worth. So the higher royalty rate you can get, the higher the value of your property. So that's just and again, I'm not an attorney. This shouldn't be construed as legal advice. Obviously, get help from a qualified attorney when you negotiate a lease, but that's my opinion on all of this. But what is your take, Justin? What do you think about his question?
I thought Greg was asking the right questions. These are all wonderful questions to look into. And like you said, man, I think the thinking is right, where, we'll look and see what favorable terms you can get in your lease. He doesn't mention the royalty rate, but that royalty rate is really the token there that's going to make a long-term impact. And something I kind of noticed here, he asked, beyond checking with neighbors, what should he factor in? Where can he get an idea? And there are a couple places that you can go when you're up against this kind of thing to compare an offer. There, Matt, one of the benefits of being a National Association of Royalty Owner members is we offer a discount to the lease price report. And this lease price report is kind of a report that'll give you by area what the going offers are for both bonus and royalty rates. And then the mineral rights form is another great place. If you're trying to get some comparison, you could look in the area and see if people are talking about other offers that they've received and how much that might be. And that gives you some platform at least to compare. Because I think that's often the question when you're in this situation is, well, what are they paying other people? That's can be a bit of a tricky question to answer. It's not necessarily public information like looking at the leases.
Yeah, that's a great point. And if you are in a situation where they're just recording a memorandum of lease in the county where those minerals are located, you can't tell what they negotiated for in terms of the royalty rate. But that is worth checking just to see if other leases have been recorded in that county, and you can see what the royalty rate that was agreed or what that was being offered, and you can use that to negotiate a better offer. So it's worth checking, with the county clerk and recorder's office and online records. If they have the deeds and leases searchable online, you can search for other oil and gas leases that have been recorded recently and see what others are getting and use that as another data point. So hopefully that helps. And thanks again for listening. So long-time listener, Greg, and he's written in a couple times. So we appreciate you, Greg.
Our next one here from Charlotte is a lot of information kind of baked into here. But Matt, I think that this is a situation where her spidey senses are going off, that this situation might not be quite right. And I think she could be right. So let's dive in. Charlotte says, I stumbled upon your podcast when a member of my family received an offer regarding mineral rights we share in Texas. I've been very suspicious and started Googling for as much information as possible. Long story short, my sister's cousins and I are recipients of mineral rights shares upon the passing of all of our parents. And my sister and I have been receiving checks since our father passed in 2011. Very small amounts, but they want to keep receiving them. Their cousin was solicited by a small company about a paid-up oil and gas lease, and was explained to him they would continue to receive his current checks, but could receive more if the drilling is successful. Their cousin told us the guy would be reaching out to all of us, which didn't happen. The phone number on the original communication didn't match the gentleman's name and came up as a local hospital phone number. Couldn't find any information about the gentleman himself. So it sounds like, Matt, I would be a little bit skeptical at this point as well. Her sisters are suspicious and have gone down a research rabbit hole, and they stumbled across our podcast. And there's a few different scenarios that this comes up. We've covered some different scams in the past, but it's really hard to say exactly what was happening without seeing a copy of the documents that this gentleman was, asking them to sign, or the paid up oil and gas lease. What can somebody do, Matt? There are a few different things. Before we hit record, we're talking about a couple different angles that you could go from in this situation. What would you do if you came across this to go kind of fact check and see, where would you start?
Yeah, this is not an uncommon situation where if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. I think so. Your instincts are right, Charlotte. And she sent the form letter, or the cover letter that was sent. I don't have a copy of that lease that she's and her cousins have received. But in this particular situation, Charlotte, the red flag that pops up to me is that you're receiving royalties currently. And again, this is assuming that it's all in the same tract or the same property that you're currently receiving royalties that this company is claiming to quote unquote lease. There's this scam that's been going on for the past couple of years where it's a term royalty deed, or it appears to be a term royalty deed. But what the person is actually conveying is not just their small interest and small royalty checks and for what it seems to be a large payment. And this is where they will come in and people don't understand what they're signing, and they're actually signing away all future royalties from some wells that are just about to get drilled. So companies will target where their company is drilling and where these people will start to receive a large increase in royalty payments. And they come in and have them sign one of these quote unquote term royalty deeds, which is really not that. And they're giving them a very low value for what they're getting in receipt. So they're getting not just the current royalty payments, but any of those future royalty payments, which are going to be substantial. And so people get cents on the dollar for what the value is there unknowingly, because they haven't done the research. They haven't determined where their property is located to see that there are permits or wells being drilled on or nearby. And so that's why I created that mineral management basics course, is to arm you with the information. So if you get an offer like this, you can do your own research, figure out it is exactly what you own. And I would say, Charlotte, that's probably, if you're still struggling, because she mentions in here that they have discovered some other things while looking into the public records regarding their interests, and that isn't quite adding up. And so I would say certainly continue to go down that rabbit hole and doing the research in the county records, getting a full picture of what you own, getting copies of those deeds and past oil and gas leases and assignments. And, it could be that this is related to some other interests that you own that maybe are different from what you're receiving royalties on. We just don't know. Obviously, there's not enough information here in the email, but I think you're on the right track. And even if you are and your cousins are interested in leasing, don't just sign the first lease that you get. Certainly have a oil and gas attorney review any paperwork before you sign it so you understand what you're signing. That could be the difference between you not falling into a trap or a scam and falling into a trap is just by getting that lease and say, well, yeah, they're going to pay us, $3,000 and we only get $50 a year. That's like an amazing deal. We're going to sell this or lease it, and not knowing that you're leaving thousands of dollars on the table, perhaps. So that's probably the biggest thing, is doing your research. So kudos on you for starting that process. If you need help and want more step-by-step information on the types of documents you should have and how to do that title search and researching the property on the State Oil and Gas website, check out the my course, the Mineral Management Basics course. And then once you're armed with the information and you're interested in leasing, and if it's a legitimate lease and maybe it's on other acreage that you aren't receiving royalties on and it isn't leased now, identify who the other companies are that are leasing in that area and try to get a couple of competing offers and try to negotiate and use an attorney if you can afford it to get the best lease possible, because that could make a huge difference in the future value of that property, like we talked about. So yeah, hopefully that helps, and good luck with everything.
Yeah, and use the operator. So if you're currently receiving checks, you can certainly talk to the operator for who you're receiving checks. They might be able to give you some information, at least about the property information for what you are being paid on to compare against that. But I think people are often hesitant to reach out to them. It may get you nowhere. However, you might get somebody really helpful on the phone. And if this is a scam that's going on in the area and these division order analysts are working in the area, they may even be aware of this. That, this is a situation where I would certainly try to level with the division order analyst if I could get them on the phone. All right, our next one's from Clarissa here. It's a very similar situation here. Clarissa says, I was wondering if you'd be able to help me search for my properties in Texas. I was going to see if I had any property left and how much it's worth. And Matt, this comes across as a very innocent question when you're first getting into the mineral rights world. But anybody that's been in it for a little bit understands just how much work is involved in answering these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is going to dovetail into the next question as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the things you can do. But, the theme here today is understanding what you own and how to research that. And we have a couple of episodes where we've covered the basics around searching the county records, and that would be in episode number 10, which is how to perform a title search. So definitely recommend listening to that episode so you can find out more about the basic steps and maybe where you can go to find some of this information online. But it's a pretty straightforward process, Clarissa. If you're looking for searching your dad's name and then also your name in those county records and see what shows up. And then if you have any deeds or leases that were acquired from an inheritance, and you could search those other relatives' names, if your grandparents or aunts and uncles or great aunts and uncles, just search for those names and keep going down that rabbit hole to find out what shows up. And you might find that there are some properties out there that are not in your name that you have a right to, and you would need to go through probate or go through to clear title to get title to those minerals. But if they're valuable, it could be well worth the effort. And it's definitely something worth understanding, at least doing that, at one time. It's sort of like doing genealogical research, and it's very related to that, in that you want to understand kind of the history in your family and, some this property that you've inherited, where it came from. Is there some other stuff out there that you don't even know about, like a long lost cousin sort of a thing? And it's the same kind of thing with property. And it's very related to genealogy. The more you know about your family history, the more names and things like that you can search in the county records and see if anything shows up. So that would be sort of the way that I would start about, listening to episode 10. Again, if you want more step-by-step instruction and checklists of all the documents you should have, all those types of things, check out my course. So mineralrightspodcast.com/courses. So good luck, Clarissa.
Good luck. And our next question from Sherry, like you said, very similar in that trying to kind of start the process of researching this. Sherry says, I was told by my dad and my great-grandparents kept the mineral rights to their property prior to me knowing them at their last. Unfortunately, my dad's passed away, which sorry, Sherry, to hear about his passing. And I know the general vicinity of the land that they owned. He showed me years ago when I was a teen. The land would have been owned 50 to 60 years ago. Can I do a mineral rights search on the Texas Railroad Commission website by their name and see if they still own the rights? Matt, how many times have you heard this story, either through the narrow or this is a very common starting point. And actually how you and I met, Matt, was me a cold call to you asking these exact questions.
Yeah, it's a very common question. So great job, Sherry, in sort of being curious and trying to find out where you would find out more information. And it's not entirely obvious a lot of times where you would find information about minerals and royalties. And the Texas Railroad Commission is extremely useful and is important for mineral and royalty owners in Texas to know how to use that website. But unfortunately, there is not a register of mineral owners out there per se. You have to do that sort of research in the county. And again, that's where we call it title search. And again, episode 10 is where we talk about how to do that type of search by the names of people. And again, you know the county, you know the location. So you already have a leg up from most people that don't even maybe know that something is out there. So you can go to the county where that property is located, do a search of the county records for your dad's name, for your great-grandparents' names, for your grandparents' names, and see what shows up and see if you can find out if they sold the minerals when they sold the surface or if they retained them. And that'll show up in the language of a deed, or maybe you'll see a very specific mineral deed being signed, or maybe they sold it or whatever. But you can get to the bottom of that by doing a title search. That's really the only way to figure that out. And thankfully, being in Texas, that is one of the best states for searching information online. Most of the counties, whether it's directly searchable from the county website, or you may have to go to a website like texasfile.com, which is a third-party service, free to search, but then you'll have to pay $1 per page to view or download the documents, which is sort of the industry, standard or going rate for those types of documents. And it's worth spending the money to get a copy of those deeds, because that's the only way you can determine whether or not those minerals are still owned or if they were sold back in the day. So that would be what I would recommend. And if we sound like a broken record, that's just that, it's the same process that we mentioned before and the same resources of episode 10 on how to perform a title search. I'll also throw out, it's worth checking the unclaimed funds website. And so with the Texas Comptroller, there's a website you can do a search for missing money or escheated royalties. And that's where the royalty check was never deposited. It was returned to the operator, and then over a period of time, by statute, they have to turn it over to the state to administer going forward. So that just means that the money is out there. You just have to prove that you're the rightful heir, and then you can claim that money. And you can learn more about that in episode 103, where we talk about how to find out if you have unclaimed royalties. So that's worth doing, even if you're not in the situation like Sherry, where you're just trying to figure this out for the first time. If you maybe have a handle on things, it's a good idea to check that website periodically and do the search for your name and your family's name, just to see if anything has been handed over since your last search. So good luck.
And last but not least, the Mineral Basics course, Matt, that you created is really a wonderful starting point for this. It's a lot to take in as somebody really coming into this and learning all the fundamentals. But in your course, you've got a module on each one of the parts that you can go back and rewatch and kind of handle it one thing at a time. So if you're really looking to get a grasp on it and use your properties and go through the process, Matt's course is a great one. All right, Matt. So our last one here is probably going to be the biggest point of conversation in the episode. But we got an email here from the listener, Paul. Paul says, "Hi, Matt. I thought I would send you this article from an American thinker in order to get your take. The author Sterling Burnett is part of the Heartland Foundation out of Illinois that I actually like and listen frequently to their podcast. They look at climate issues very realistically. I haven't listened to your podcast number 297 yet, but I will soon. And your key takeaway section actually makes the carbon capture section of the Big Beautiful Bill seem less onerous than the Sterling Burnett indicates in his article. And Matt, I think this is a really big conversation right now. There's a couple different types of conversations going on right now about carbon sequestration. So I think it's kind of important to set the stage there, and that there is a carbon sequestration where they're actually pumping the carbon into formations to store it. And that is not necessarily what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about carbon sequestration, capture and storage, but also its use in enhanced oil recovery, which, we've always kind of talked about as a benefit for mineral owners because it more effectively develops that formation. It also ensures that, these wells that might not be top performers after EOR can really produce some more income for mineral owners.
Yeah, and I think, if you read this article that he's referring to, the gist of it is that the 45Q tax credit, which is the carbon capture and storage tax credit that incentivizes company to store CO2 in those rock formations, like Justin mentioned, it actually increases the payout. This One Big Beautiful Bill Act increases the payout, surprisingly, for captured carbon. But the thing that it does do, and really the gist of what we were trying to get at and what we thought was beneficial to mineral and royalty owners, was that it was allowing for enhanced oil recovery to receive some benefit under that scheme. And so I don't disagree that it could be this 45Q tax credit is incentivizing a certain thing for the sake of whether it's good or bad and may or may not be economically viable without those tax credits. In my mind, it becomes then a subsidy of whatever that thing is that the government is trying to incentivize. In this case, carbon capture and sequestration. Like Justin mentioned, we were talking about this before we hit record. And you brought up a good point, Justin, about carbon capture and storage being potentially damaging to mineral and royalty owners. You want to talk about that and what we should know about that part of it?
Yeah, and there's been a lot of conversation, which for those that want to learn more, Martha Barnes has really been kind of the leading authority in the National Association of Royalty Owners bringing up this issue. But there's some talk and some different projects that have been tossed around. I don't know that anything's set into stone yet, where they are essentially storing the CO2 into formations that have been produced. And that creates a takings essentially for any of the royalties that might be stored under wherever they're storing that carbon. And there's a lot of facets to work out when it comes to that. But it's caused a lot of concern for mineral owners because if they're going to come in and they're going to put that carbon into that formation and then ensure that it's not going to be pierced so that the carbon can't be released and there's viable production underneath that, then that creates a major issue where how are you going to develop those minerals underneath? And so that's been a lot of conversation in Oklahoma, I think, especially. I don't know if there's been anything, any movements towards actually putting this into act, but there's been a lot of conversation about how it might impact others. So we'll see where that goes. But it is very different, Matt, than the enhanced oil recovery that's happening with the carbon versus just storing it and locking out the minerals.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's interestingly, we actually produce carbon dioxide so that we can inject it as part of enhanced oil recovery. So there's actually a large formation where CO2 exists underground. And it's something in southwest Colorado and sort of the Four Corners area. So that Cortez, area within Colorado, they produce CO2, they ship it down through New Mexico into the Permian. They use it for enhanced oil recovery through injecting CO2 into the oil formation to increase the recovery rate of the oil. And so when we were talking about this big, beautiful bill act and the 45Q tax credits and the enhanced oil recovery benefit, particularly, we're looking at it from a royalty owner perspective. And from that standpoint, if you have minerals in a mature play, like in the Permian, where they're doing enhanced oil recovery, whether that's a water flood or CO2 flood, this incentivizing companies to do more of that will benefit mineral and royalty owners because it means more oil and gas will be extracted from those existing formations. So we'll see continuation of our royalty payments, continuation of production, and in particular, for a longer period of time. And whether you argue that there is an environmental benefit to storing CO2 downhole or not, which I would argue is, I would agree, with this article that it's hard to measure and it's hard to know for sure if the CO2 that you pump underground is going to stay there forever and if it's going to have a meaningful impact over a long term. And so it could be really not that impactful. So I don't disagree there. But the thing that will be impactful is by increasing the recovery rate. So if you think about oil and gas has a certain environmental impact. If we can increase the life of existing wells, we're minimizing the impact from having to drill additional wells to get that next barrel of oil. Because the fact of the matter is we need oil and gas to sustain our standard of living and to sustain life as we know it. So if we're going to continue to get that oil anyway, if we can double the recovery rate from the existing wells without, basically we're eliminating having to drill that next well. And that has a positive environmental impact, I would argue, because you're not having to go and disrupt the land and the wildlife habitat and the drilling and using more energy to get that out. You can actually incrementally get more energy with less input energy by doing these enhanced oil recovery projects potentially. So from that standpoint, I think it's good because the fact is we only actually recover between 5 and 10% of the oil from a unconventional reservoir. So that's from these horizontal wells and these shale wells that are being drilled right now. So if you could double that, that actually extending the life of all of the tens or hundreds of thousands of wells that have been drilled over the past decade, you can just continue the recovery without having to drill those additional wells. And that's that's a huge benefit for mineral and royalty owners because it means we'll continue to get royalties longer than the original well would support if it was just on primary recovery. And so that's, I guess, the big takeaway there. And that's why we were hopeful and positive about that element of the Big Beautiful Bill Act. I don't disagree, Paul, with your, the article's gist here. And, it's got some good points for sure about the taxpayer cost. That is something to consider, whether the environmental impact from enhanced oil recovery or CO2 sequestration, more importantly, is actually a net benefit, I think is arguable as well. So yeah, interesting that when you look at the big picture, you got to take all that into account, but we were really looking at it from a mineral and royalty owner perspective, which I do think it's a benefit if it means more enhanced oil recovery.
Yeah, I thought the article that Paul shared had some really great points, and looking at it from a much higher level and the environmental impact. And then I don't disagree. This is the government's particularly bad at a lot of things, and programs like this is something they're particularly bad at. But if it really promotes that enhanced oil recovery, I think there is an end result benefit for mineral owners, as long as that remains true.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that wraps up this month's listener questions episode. If you have a question you'd like us to answer, you can email it to feedback@mineralrightspodcast.com. Again, we'll link to all the resources we mentioned today in the show notes, which you can find at mineralrightspodcast.com. Thanks again for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.